The budget has been presented, the much-awaited election budget or pre-election budget. To answer a few more questions about the assumptions on tax and on revenues, I have with me Sanjeev Sanyal, the economic advisor to the Finance Ministry. Sanjeev, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, first, let me clarify a wee bit in terms of the assumptions of tax collection. You know, the current year's tax collection in FY19BE was, tax revenue was assumed to grow by 19.2. Actually, year to date, it is less than 12%. But when the RE of FY19 is with us, it shows an estimate of 19.5. I mean, do you really think that in the last 2 months, the tax collection can rise by that much?
Yes, this is what the Revenue Department is, that there is, in fact, very large amount of tax buoyancy that is expected. So there is an expectation that this money will indeed come in, particularly from direct taxes. So there is fair amount of buoyancy in direct taxes that is there in the, if you look at the budget at a glance, that has been put together.
Okay. Nevertheless, the borrowing program for this year is still increased by 20,000 crores. That has sent the yields surging. That's a bit of a worry for the bond market.
No, I don't think it's such a large deviation. I mean, it is true that the fiscal deficit is somewhat higher than the budgeted number. But on the other hand, take a wider look. I mean, the fact of the matter is, till not very long ago, we used to debate, you know, between 4.5 or 5.5% of GDP. Nowadays, we get panicked about 3.3 and 3.4 or 3.5. So I think we have made a lot of progress. Moreover, I think the more interesting point, which nobody seems to be discussing, is that the primary deficit has actually been kept well in control. So if you look at the primary deficit, in fact, it has done better than what had been budgeted. It's at 0.2% of GDP. Essentially, there is no primary deficit to speak of. Our fiscal deficit effectively is because of interest payments that have on debt accumulated over many years. And you know, one could argue that it has something at least to do with the fact that interest rates were perhaps kept somewhat higher than should have been kept.
Well, the revenue deficit actually is going up, or actually at least is not going down. Would you worry that we shouldn't be doing that?
I don't think that, as I said, the deviations are very, very small compared to what we have historically been used to. It is well within what is, I think, acceptable.
Well, you know, the historical comparisons don't always work. Historically, the UPA did not have the advantage of $60 per barrel of crude for a better part of their term. So just doing better than them is not good enough, because we have a very good macro in terms of crude prices, isn't it?
You have to remember that no such thing like oil bonds was also floated. So in that sense, many off-balance sheet debts were not accumulated in the same way.
Okay, well, more generally, when crude is kind to us, we should have reduced our fiscal deficit. We have not. Our fiscal deficit remains much the same for the last 4 years.
Well, I think, no, that's being a bit clever by half, for the simplest reason that oil prices did spike up last year. And you saw that for the most part, it was passed through. Even though at that point in time, you will remember, there was a fair amount of political pressure to act otherwise. There was something at the margin was done, but for the most part, it was allowed to flow through. And despite that, inflation, by the way, remained very well behaved. So I think you need to give credit where credit is due.
Okay. Let me look at Capex. You know, the extent to which capital expenditure has risen from the RE of current year is just 6%. You know, that's not very helpful when we have a lot of infrastructure to build.
Well, I mean, that has obviously been taken into account. So you have the numbers as they are. And I think capital expenditure, as you have seen over the last several years, have been very, very robust. I don't think anybody will make the case that, you know, a dramatic expansion in our, you know, the airports around the country or in the highway building and so on. I don't think anybody can fault this government for not taking infrastructure seriously.
Yeah, I know, but the outlay has not been as high as one would have liked for Capex. Would you say, therefore, that the thrust of this budget is to try and boost the economy through consumption?
Certainly, there has been an effort to do two things. One is that clearly some support was needed for the farm sector, especially since you see when you have had this huge amount of decline in food inflation, in some cases into negative territory. Remember, that's a boost to the rest of the economy in a sense that the rest of the economy benefits from having cheaper food. So you can think of this as some transfer of wealth from the rest of the economy to the farmers, which I think is fair enough. In a sense, they are the people who are pulling down inflation and will have consequently created the space for what I think should be structurally lower interest rates. So I think in that sense, this is a small payback to them to allow them to go through the transition.
Okay. Well, let me come back to the, tax assumptions. This is a question which the bond markets have, SMS to me, and I'm basically paraphrasing what they are asking. They do worry that, the tax assumption of 19% is way above the 11.5% in the first 9 months of the current year. And on this 19% next year, the tax assumption is 14.9. So when, the year-to-date tax collection is less than 12%, both these assumptions is troubling them. And there is a fear that next year's borrowing program, like this year, could get revised higher. What would be your answer to the bond markets?
Well, first of all, I think you have got to have some trust in what the kind of information we have based our forecasts on. And also remember that, the next year's forecast is not out of whack. I mean, if you take, let's say, 7.5% GDP growth rate, which is, will be par for the course, take 4% inflation and allow for very small buoyancy in tax collections, particularly the income tax side, you would get those numbers. It doesn't require a very complex and very ambitious forecasts to get those kinds of numbers.
Clearly, a lot of people in the market are not sharing that kind of tax buoyancy. But even on growth assumptions, the global environment is not very kind. Most of the global agencies have marked down global growth. In that context, growth also could have a problem in India, wouldn't it?
No, but remember, we are one country where we have enormous space for reduction of interest rates in an environment where global growth is slow. Also, you have to take the other side of it, which is that commodity prices will be much weaker, energy prices will be weaker, global interest rates will, in fact, you've already seen that happening with the US Fed, take a trajectory which is much flatter. So why wouldn't you take advantage of that? There are certain things, the natural stabilizers compensating. And it happens to be that we are in a position where we can take massive benefits from that. So why wouldn't you allow us the benefit of that as well?
No, that point is very well taken, and there could be a couple of rate cuts perhaps in FY19, in calendar 19. But, even then, most of the bond dealers I speak with believe that that may bring down the overnight rates and the near-term rates, maybe, 3-month rates, treasury bill rates, but it may only lead to steepening with the 10-year not falling much because there is so much of borrowing by the sovereign.
I'm not in a position, obviously, to comment on market participants. They are welcome to have their own opinion. I'm just pointing out to you that you cannot take a worldview where everything goes in one way. There are balancing factors. So if global growth slows down, many other things also happen. You cannot have an environment of stagflation being your main assumption of the world.
No, not at all, not at all. Not when you're a 7% growth country. Stagnation is not even in our lexicon. But my point is that, to argue that because we've got global growth slowing and commodity prices slowing and therefore we could have interest rate cuts, the argument is that that will not work in terms of lower cost of capital because there is a crowding out effect. This year, I mean, for FY20, the central government is gross borrowing is going to be very close to 7 trillion, 6.7 trillion rupees, and plus you have a state borrowing of about 6.5 trillion. So it's nearly 13 trillion rupees that the governments are borrowing. The worry, therefore, is that the cost of capital will not cheapen.
So I don't think well, our economy is also growing. So the point of the matter is it's a matter of judgment or whether our financial markets and our our system can take those kinds of borrowings. All we are arguing is our judgment that it can.
Okay. Well, one ethical argument, technically it is possible that there is going to be a different finance minister, even a different party in May. Was it ethical really to have forced tax changes of this order on the next government? Should it not have become applicable from June 1st rather than April 1st?
Well, I mean, this is a political decision, and the democratically elected government of the day has to take that decision. It is not an economics question, if that's what you're asking.
Right.
As far as I know, the government of the day takes a call on it, and it took a certain call.
No, well, the previous times at such occasions, the new taxes were always made applicable when we return, or if we return. That's what finance ministers normally said.
So if a government returns, if a government comes and finds any of the measures particularly objectionable, then in June, July, whenever a budget is presented, they can reverse it. I mean, it is not the case that it is an irreversible move. So if it so be that the new government is a different government and has different priorities, they can reprioritize.
Okay.
It's, I think, fair enough that the government of the day has the mandate right now to present a certain budget. Incidentally, it did not present a full budget. It is an interim budget, maybe a little souped up one, but still it is not the case that this was a full budget. There are many, many things that were essentially left untouched.
Yeah, no, it's a little messy just to have a to and fro on something as basic as income tax. But let me finally ask you this, Sanjeev. What is the basic thrust of this budget? What is it seeking to achieve?
Basically, the idea was that we have seen certain developments over the last several years. One of them was a dampening of agricultural prices. So although in terms of sheer expansion and output, the farmers of this country have done very well. But in fact, their success itself has dampened their incomes by pushing down prices. So a certain transfer of income was necessary because, remember, dampening down of food prices is in some ways a transfer, it's a subsidy by the farming sector to the rest of us. So this is a sort of payback. So this was a rebalancing act that was done. That is one. Secondly, the middle class of this country has certainly contributed. There's been a dramatic improvement in tax compliance. They've also, of course, borne the brunt of many changes we made, which are long-term changes, which are good, like GST and so on. But nevertheless, it did cause some amount of stress to them. So it was thought that at least the lower and middle class should be, again, also given certain amount of relief, which I think is fair enough. So I think that was basically the thrust of what was done. Other than that, most things have actually been left in place. It is indeed an interim budget, despite maybe some political annoyance at it. But the fact of the matter, most things have actually been left in place. Okay.
Well, Sanjeev, you were one of the earliest economists to point out that we have a surplus in agriculture, and one needs to look at agriculture differently. I remember that you saying that in an interview much earlier. Now, instead of investing more in construction or infrastructure and sucking away that labor, providing it an alternative occupation, asking them to stay on there and giving them an income doesn't seem like a damn good idea. That money has been given to them and not put in, say, construction.
No,
your capex is 6%. That's not good. Barely meets inflation.
No, I think no, I think this is the wrong way to think about it. Clearly, we do want the rest of the economy to grow. You've already seen, of course, we want the construction sector, whether it's services and other sectors, to continuously grow. We continue to expect urbanization. I don't think a benefit around 6,000 rupees a year fundamentally changes the dynamics of that. Okay. What it does do is provide certain amount of supplemental income to farmers who clearly would have felt the problem of dampened prices at the margin. So, I mean, it is the case that they have produced more food or whatever agricultural produce they were doing, even non-foods. So this is just to top it up. Yeah, and in some ways this is fair because the rest of us are benefiting from very cheap food. I mean, not so long ago, we used to have these spikes in onion prices causing middle class angst and so on. That's suddenly become a matter of the past. Okay. So think of this as a top-up to the farmers, and somebody did have to pay for it, and it happens to be the farmer. This is a payback to them. Okay, no, I'm not grudging that. It's just that it's not going to the landless labor. It's not going to the tenant farmer. It's going to guys who have land. I mean, it doesn't seem all that fair. It doesn't solve. Nobody is saying this is one time solves every problem in rural India. Nobody has made the claim. I don't think the finance minister has made the claim. Okay. This is a transfer to the rural sector of a certain kind. Now, hopefully, there will be some multiplier effects from it, from people spending and so on. Yes. But even then, no claim is being made that every problem in rural India has suddenly been sorted out as a result of this. Okay. So we continue to require the rest of the economy to do well. We still need to and of course, a vision was painted out as well towards 2030, if you saw that. And that does obviously include keeping the economy running at a high rate, keeping job creation going, and many other things. And it's not about, there certainly isn't the case that this attempt was, oh, we need to keep our farmers back in the villages doing whatever they're doing for all time to come. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Sanjeev Sanyal, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for giving us the inspiration behind the budget, the premises behind the budget, and how you expect things to pan out. Thank you very much for joining us.